Hey guys, welcome to yet another episode of Artist Podcast. And today we have a very special episode because we've got four speakers instead of the usual one. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. But I need to inform you that this is a collaborative project with an organization called Hype Sri Lanka. And to introduce to you who they are, it's an organization that is focused on the betterment of the youth and implementation of ideas, or rather making a reality of the mandate, needs, and necessities of the next generation of leaders. Hype Sri Lanka is Sri Lanka's only youth incubator, and we do a tremendous amount of projects that is youth-based and youth-focused. To have more information about what we do, have a look at their website, which could be found on my description or on my link on Instagram, similarly on YouTube and Facebook, wherever you find this media. And what I want to talk to you about is who our speakers are and why we have these set of speakers. These set of speakers were people who worked with me, a project that I focused on, which was the creation of policy proposal for that was to be sent to the parliamentary select committee on election laws and electoral systems, reforms to it. And this was a project that my team and I completed in the span of 2 to 3 weeks, right? So the four people who we have here are the four focal points, people who carried out the creation and the implementation of pretty much entire chapters, and I think have done tremendous work. I want to call each and every one of them individually because they will be taking on the responsibility of explaining or answering questions specific to those chapters, which would allow you to have a much more clear understanding than it would be for me to explain it, right? So I would like them to introduce themselves. And so let us first and foremost start with Shaheen Abdul Ghani. Shaheen, you can go ahead, Shaheen.
Hi everyone, my name is Shaheen. I am graduating from Gateway College in August this year, and I'm a published poetess. I was a part of the subcommittee at Hype SL working on this particular proposal, and I was heading the representation team. So my colleague and I worked on 7 proposals specifically to increase representation of women, members of the youth, and members of indigenous communities of Sri Lanka, and get them to have more sort of a word in all decision-making institutions of Sri Lanka, and not only the parliament. So that's my contribution to this proposal. Imad, you can go ahead.
All right. So, hi everyone. My name is Imad Muwahid. I finished my A levels, and I too will be graduating in August. I was the head prefect of Gateway College Dehibula, and my contribution as part of the subcommittee on the youth public proposal was centered upon an interesting concept about delimitation and demarcation of electoral boundaries, and how it has the potential to affect all areas of the electoral process in Sri Lanka. So I feel it is of fundamental importance that we have sessions like this today to discuss how it could affect the future progress of Sri Lanka and how it could affect the elections as a whole. Over to you, Farhan.
Thank you, Imad. So, guys, thank you, Atif. So, what my team, along with a couple of other friends, colleagues rather, we worked on the proposal which talked about making elections technologically viable. So what we have talked about essentially is bitcoins, ledgers, audit trails, and all of the other fancy stuff that we can actually include in our proposal and in our election system as a whole. So what this focuses on is actually making the entire electoral system much more efficient than it is in Sri Lanka now. And we can do that through the implementation of cybersecurity, through the implementation of technology, and as a result, we can increase accessibility to elections. So I think that is killing multiple birds with one stone, and I'm really excited to talk about what my team and I have come up with. So credit to everyone who worked on this particular proposals rather, and all the other committees as well, which had Imad, Shaheen, and Malin as the focal points. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Farhan Naushad, and introducing myself right now. I currently have done 1 year of my business degree at Monash College, and hopefully I'll be doing my next 2 years in the near future. So I am extremely enthusiastic about multiple topics, two of them being coffee and football, and I'm really excited to be on this show today here, Atif.
So, hello everyone. My name is Malin Kaushika, and I'm currently reading for my LLB in CFPS Law School under the University of London programs. So, essentially, on my part of the proposal, I looked at how the system itself should change. Right. What I believe as an individual is to not to focus on giving the party itself more power, but to give the candidates itself the choice to choose their representatives. Right. So in my team, the alternate electoral systems, we've mainly looked at two aspects, right? The local government elections and the parliamentary elections. So me and especially Atif, shout out to Atif. We both worked on the local government elections when it comes to the proposals and whatnot. And my secondary objective that I worked on in this proposal specifically deals with the looking into solutions of election monitoring and to curb election violence in the first place, right? And to look at, and within that, I looked into certain solutions on how we can regulate finances and whatnot. With that, back to you, Atif.
And without further ado, let's quickly skip to the questions, right? The first question goes out to Shaheen. Shaheen, seeing as though the local authorities elections are what's coming up next, right? And it's a great venue for minority participants and along with it women to begin their political careers. What are the caveats in the system that you see currently, and what is it that must be done in order to fix such issues to promote more and more grassroots level politicians?
So, if we are to talk about the sort of limitations that exist, unfortunately, there are many of them. One of which in particular, which is fairly damaging to representation, is that if a female is nominated through paper and has the highest number of votes in a ward, but is moved to an additional nominal paper list and is replaced by another female or another member in itself with a less number of votes, it would allow that that person to secure that particular seat through the PR system that the government currently follows. And that in itself is damaging to democracy, because now the person who you vote for doesn't get this opportunity of a seat and therefore can't represent you. So a possible solution to this, and what we've mentioned in our proposal, is an amendment to the local ordinance, to the local government election ordinance. It's Article 28(2). And in this, we want to add a clause that prohibits the movement of candidates in the nomination paper after the submission of the nomination list is done to the election commission, because quite often it's after that process that, the moving around happens. But secondly, and I think a little bit more importantly, is a mandatory quota that we have requested for women in parliament, right? Currently, it's no hidden fact. It's all out in the open that a lot of decision-making institutes of Sri Lanka are largely male-dominated. And the moment you don't have females in parliament, obviously subjects that female want to see discussed and debated aren't out there, right? So we've requested for a mandatory 25% quota for women in parliament. Now, of course, this quota alone is not the be-all, end-all solution, and it's not this sort of blanket solution that you can apply in order to increase female representation, but it's quite the beginning. And you can't just put this female quota in it, because the government already tried to do this previously. They failed, and that's because the people who really needed to be in these sort of positions of power weren't empowered enough to get to these positions of power. And therefore, if we are to reintroduce this 25% mandatory quota for women, it has to come with other things like education and training, like informing them of their political rights and educating them as to how they can really become an important part of this negotiation and discussion table.
Thank you for that, Shaheen. Actually, you touched on something that I didn't even ask about. You touched on the parliamentary quota system and the need for a permanent quota for women in the parliament too. That was something I didn't touch on, but thank you for that. Thank you very much for that question, for answering that question. But the next question that I have is for Farhan. Farhan, knowing how passionate you are about digital elections and blockchain ledgers, systems, could you expound upon the efficacy of its use in our Sri Lankan election system, and how it can be used to establish uh, audit trails and making sure that we keep track of the movement of votes, we keep track of the movement of funding for conducting the election, and apart from that, matters relating to the election. So, quite essentially, how we can build up a transparency system using this blockchain system or ledger system.
So the reason as to why this particular proposal was included, even proposed, was because of the fact that in the past, not only in Sri Lanka, but in many countries, in many developing democracies, have had claims, even in countries like the United States of America, of election tampering. So, what we want to actually avoid through the integration of audit trails, through the integration of blockchain technology as well as ledgers, we just want to ensure that whatever happens with regards to the election database is not being tampered with. And if it is tampered with, it goes on to the audit trail, it goes on to the entire blockchain system, and essentially we find out where the change has been made, and even goes to the extent of who the change has been made by. And what can happen in this situation is, say, I cast my vote, and someone in the election system itself changes my vote. For example, I voted for party A and they change my vote to party B. That goes in the audit trail. So we can actually find out or get an independent body to investigate into the elections and find out if any election tampering has gone on, and if it has, to take the necessary action or to take the steps forward to take necessary action against this. So this is why blockchains, audit trails, and ledgers are extremely important, I feel, especially when you're going to make an election electric. So as of now, when everything is manual, when everything is not in an electronic format, we wouldn't ever know if something like this takes place. But with the onset of technology, we actually have so much more capability to identify any if any change is happening in the election.
Thank you for that, Farhan. I too completely agree that we need to have a system that's as transparent as possible, such that we know the fact that votes have been casted, A, and B, we are understanding, or the people assured that their votes haven't shifted. And I understand that trust in a blockchain system, it'll take a long time for people to take, belief that a blockchain system is actually fair. But the reality behind a blockchain system, the reason why multiple people invest in cryptocurrency is simply because of the trust they have in such a system. But I want to get back to Shaheen, and I have a question for you. Shaheen, you talked about parliamentary quotas, right, in your previous answer. But apart from these parliamentary quotas and nomination quotas, what other ways do you see to empower disenfranchised groups like people not of political background, women and indigenous people, or quite essentially the youth as well, people who lack this sort of funding, um, stand headstrong in an election and say, okay, we're going to win the election? The ability, people who have an inability because of their geographic location, such sort of people, how do you think we can empower them and promote them in competing in more and more elections?
Okay, so most often than not, the biggest barrier to entry for women or for members or people who don't come from political legacies is their lack of finance, because finance essentially translates into your capability of holding more campaigns, of getting your getting your word across to more people, and therefore more people voting for you, which finally will grant you a seat, right? And because you don't have finance, that entire chain in itself gets disturbed at the very beginning, right? So in order to get rid of that sort of root cause that exists in society, we've proposed for women and disenfranchised groups, which includes indigenous people, to get access to finances through internal fundraising, media provisions, and the subsidizing of campaign finance. So ideally, what would happen is that the election commission should determine the eligibility of individuals who will be then granted this sort of benefit from a state fund. And this would obviously come after a series of assessments, and these assessments could be on their current incomes, on what their assets are, what their financial documents like property deeds and bank statements look like. And the election commission will also be responsible for determining the terms and conditions of how it has to be paid back. Because obviously this money, because it comes from a state fund, will have to be paid back. But of course, with an interest rate of zero, and with a relatively long credit period, because the entire point of giving these people subsidies in the very first place is because they can't afford it. And therefore, all that should be kept in mind when determining what the payback period. It's also very important to note is that this sort of state benefit will only, and therefore it's only mutually exclusive to people who can't receive external finances. This looks like new members who want to join the political sphere. It looks like relatively young candidates or female candidates who don't get support in terms of monetary support or even like media coverage from mainstream companies, both public, private, and media companies. So this will be exclusively for them, and it is going to get rid of one of the biggest burdens, I would say, that currently exists and stops people from actually reaching out and at least started political journey.
Thank you very much for that, Shaheen. I too personally agree with you. I too believe that some sort of funding mechanism needs to be created because we've established for quite a long time that the fundamental problem in Sri Lanka and all other Southeast Asian countries and underdeveloped countries or even developing countries is the fact that parliamentarians or people who are looking at political positions aren't able to sum up the sort of fund they require, right? Let's say 50, 60 years ago, we've seen multiple political mandates coming up where a parliamentarian or a member of the house or someone has been chosen merely on the fact of who they are because the public themselves fund that campaign. But it's very hard to see that sort of a movement today. I really agree with you, and I think even New Zealand has done a very similar system with regards to making media available to the candidates. I'm not quite sure about the system, but I'm very sure that in the 2010s a law was passed in New Zealand on that regard. But let me quickly hop on to the next question which I have posed for Farhan. So this question is with regards to double voting and voter fraud, right? Farhan, this issue, the issue of voter fraud, seems to have been an extremely hot topic in the last 2 years, right? Not last 2 years, I'd say the last 10 years. The issue, the 2016 elections, the 2020 elections in the US, right? We've had that sort of an issue. And it's not just that, but in Sri Lanka, we've also had that sort of an issue for decades simply because of the fact that the minimum required authentication would be your identity card and few matters which can easily be manipulated, right? You can manipulate the system on election day. Regulations have been like, people have raised the question if it's strong enough or not. So I want to ask you if there is a sort of system that can be brought in place for better voter authentication, identification, and to prevent this sort of voter fraud that has deprived Sri Lankans, citizens of Sri Lanka, the right to vote, the most fundamental right, and the right promised to them as being part of a sovereign state.
Right. So thank you for that question. It's extremely valid. So this is one thing that we have to notice. With the integration of technology, not everything is going to be seamless. We have seen that in multiple election systems that countries have tried to include technology, but have actually gone back to pen and paper voting. And that was one of the things that concerned me in the research that I did for this particular proposal. But I kept the belief, and I still strongly believe, that technology, if used right in an election context, can take the election and actually maximize the efficiency of an election by a lot. So, essentially, what we need to do, the first step towards having a successful, technologically inclusive election, is to appoint a cybersecurity team. And this has to be a cybersecurity team which is A, reputed, and B, a third party cybersecurity team that would not actually take any sides in a particular election. So these are two things: the independence and the quality of the cybersecurity team should not be compromised upon. And moving on to the actual issue of voter fraud itself, double voting, those kind of things, what we have proposed in our proposal is that we use things such as a database, so a voter registration database going into the elections. And while at the elections, we actually use the information that we collected from the voter registration database, which includes things like biometrics, which includes, facial scanning, which includes fingerprints, those things that are unique to an individual is what is used when registration for the voter registration database. And when elections come by, say I go and cast my vote, I keep my fingerprint and I get my face scanned, and then the system knows. So the automated system that we are proposing knows that the vote has been cast from this particular person and will reject any other votes being casted from that particular person as well. So this is what we have proposed to actually, counter voter fraud and double voting. And I think that is way more efficient than having just a pen and paper and trying just after a person has cast their vote to cut their name off a list. These are extremely inefficient and wasteful. So I think we can actually counter so many of these problems by implementing technology in an election context.
Thank you very much for that, Farhan. I too believe that it's important that transparency mechanisms are of great importance to any state that looks at modernizing itself and going ahead. And the incorporation of technology is inevitable. And actually, in our conversation with representatives from CMEV and IFES, I also realized that they were very much hesitant about the introduction of an e-voting system or a platform that introduces or makes use of technology, and they very much emphasized about how countries have gone back. But I think an issue or a fundamental thing that a lot of people fail to understand, that technology is not static. It's the most dynamic thing that we have, right? Innovation is the most dynamic thing that we have, and it keeps changing. And it's very important that the people understand that in the future we might have better technology. There might be better instances for us, and there might be better opportunities for using an e-voting system. But thank you for that again, once again, Farhan. And I just want to get to a question to Imad. Imad, understanding Imad is who took care of the, just because it's been a while, Imad is the person who took care of the delimitation segment of our paper. And so this question to him is on that regard. Imad, understanding that the bar for impartiality for the delimitation process or the delimitation commission, apologies, is merely based on the president's approval. What kind of a system do you suggest be implemented to make sure that the members are impartial in their action and representative of the people? Because this constitutional requirement for the president to be satisfied that these people are quote unquote not involved in political matters isn't the strongest bar to define whether or not they are to be fair, they are to be not involved in political decisions, the political situation in a country. That's quite rare that we see it, right? I mean, yes, maybe there is a high possibility of them being impartial members, but as a state, a legal system needs to be created in order to protect us in all instances, not on the basis of the character of a single president or anybody, but on the basis that the constitution is what trumps us. How do you think we should redesign the requirement where it goes from the president's approval to a constitutional approval?
Sure, that's a great question, Atif. But before that, just for our viewers who may not have a solid idea about what delimitation is about, firstly, delimitation seems like an alien word at the beginning. However, it simply means the drawing and setting of electoral boundaries. This could be for the large electoral districts, for the small electoral units, even for like the Gram Niradaris, administrative districts, those all count as constituencies that delimitation is involved in. So the reason it's important is that the delimitation process affects many parts involved in the electoral system. So especially in a country like Sri Lanka, which is highly multicultural, you see a lot of people of different ethnicities are scattered across the country. They're scattered all over the country. Definitely, there are in certain places where certain ethnic minorities are concentrated. However, if you look at the general aspect, if you look at the general part of Sri Lanka, a lot of people of different ethnicities are scattered across the country. And why is this important? Why does this matter? It's important because if this is the case, boundaries have to be drawn in a way that reflects the rights and the representation of all communities. Regarding impartiality, there are a number of recommendations that the proposal calls for. Firstly, we try to solve the problem from its root cause, the composition, or essentially who is involved in the delimitation process. So, for this, we call for an amendment to Article 95 of the Constitution, where we are allowing a greater panel of experts when making such decisions over delimitation. In the current constitution, it does allow for a sort of a loophole of ambiguity because it allows for the president to decide on who is actively engaged in politics or not. And we believe this could be somewhat subjective. Therefore, what we call for is a higher threshold or a higher criteria to be set for who exactly constitutes as impartial rather than allow any space for ambiguity or loopholes which could allow the commission to be biased or to not produce the most accurate results that we need. Secondly, we also called for two political members who are not democratically elected and will be nominated by both the majority party and the minority party of parliament to be on the delimitation commission. Why? This is important because we understand that the importance of keeping these two ministers in the loop. And secondly, we are anticipating further problems because A, that these people do not have the ability to have a majority in the commission. So therefore they can't sway decisions. Therefore, we are actually anticipating problems like gerrymandering, which you see is a highly common issue in the US. We're anticipating such problems and we're trying to solve it. We're trying to nip it from the bud. We're preventing it before it can even happen. So we believe that such standards we are following international values because the fact that two members elected by both parties, the system actually exists in New Zealand, and what we're trying to do here is we're trying to replicate the same sort of international standards that govern the delimitation process. Another important factor to note that we proposed was that we called for the commission to have a term of 3 years. So, like you said, this solves the problem of changes in government because when the term has 3 years, there's a higher likelihood of it being prevented from having political affiliations or being affected, or the conclusions of the commission being affected by changes in government. So this is another important change that we're talking about. And another way of maintaining impartiality is actually by promoting transparency in itself. We recognize that a lot of the international values surrounding delimitation is actually intertwined. So, for example, we propose greater information sharing with the public in a similar model that it's actually modeled after a law, if I'm not mistaken, in 1964 in Canada, where the government grants the people the opportunity to present the views and their suggestions on the conclusions of the commission. Here, what we're going to do is we are recommending an official web portal to be developed in Sri Lanka to allow educated members of the community, educated members of society to actually put forward any suggestions and recommendations since there's a higher likelihood that they are more aware of the local issues and concerns surrounding the system from the bottom level itself. So we believe that this web portal would not only act as an opportunity for public participation, but it also promotes impartiality. Why? Because you're allowing for the public eye to be engaged in this process, and this makes sure that there is a robust checks and balances system that governs the actions of the delimitation commission. So therefore, the public is now going to be notified about changes made by local authorities for the boundaries or certain aspects of the delimitation commission that were not previously revealed. And this is extremely important in order to create this enhanced environment of impartiality and transparency, which bolsters the values that should exist in the ideal delimitation process, as in other countries in New Zealand and Canada. What we're trying to do here is replicate that same model in Sri Lanka.
I really agree with what you have to say, Imad. I too personally believe that the system needs to be rethought. And talking about delimitation, thank you in the first place for explaining what delimitation is and how it sort of is as a result of land demarcation and its importance in the way we perceive how an election works. But for the viewers, I think you would have a good understanding of the effects of bad delimitation, bad demarcation in the case of Kashmir. Right? We understand that for decades there's been an issue in Kashmir simply on the basis that delimitation had not taken place with the best of conscience of the two countries, and there's been constant dispute between the two countries. Another example that you should, like, how to say, perhaps research on or read on is that of St. Kitts and Nevis, where it's Caribbean country where the redrawing of the constituency boundaries were done so badly that even after getting it through Privy Council, simply because an election is a short period of time, the way it was done was so horrendous that it essentially resulted in the election process itself being affected, like ballots being printed and whatnot. So I think that we see the dangers of bad delimitation here in those two very examples. One is an international example, a symbol of global disputes, national disputes, and another example of how a faulty delimitation can actually affect the democratic process of a nation. My next question essentially goes to Marlin. Marlin, vote education is something that's extremely important, right? As people, you need to know who to vote for, how to vote, and how your votes are casted. And in the case of voter education, especially among the youth, it is key to ensure that the will of the people is served, right? And could you perhaps kindly explain how the current parliamentary systems and the presidential election systems respectively work, so that the viewers understand, how their votes are counted, where their votes go to, the importance of a preference vote. Thank you.
Sure, Atif. But before I move on, I would like to apologize to the viewers if they can't see me because I have a technical difficulty. But going on to your question, yes. So the presidential elections and the parliamentary elections work on two distinct electoral systems, right? The presidential elections run on something called the two round or the instant runoff system. Okay, so this sort of system emphasizes on giving your preference between two candidates, right? Between two conflicting candidates who you feel that should take power. We see in Sri Lanka, we as voters indicate you should ideally indicate three preferences, right? Your first preference, your second preference, and your third preference, right, on your ballot sheet. And this is limited to two rounds. That's why it's normally called a two-round voting system. During the counting process, firstly, the proportion of first preference votes of the candidates are taken into account. And if the candidate has managed to secure a majority, by majority I mean 51% or more of the current vote, then they're deemed as the winner of the particular presidential election. If we see that in status quo, certain members of the Sri Lankan society mistakens the Sri Lankan presidential election for a plurality system, or where you choose one person. And that sort of misconception arises because since 1982, we've had every single president being elected from the first round itself with a 51 or more percentage of a majority. However, if in the first round no candidate has not secured a majority, then it goes to something called a runoff round, right? Or to the second round, right? And in this instance, what happens is the candidates that have been eliminated and the remaining candidates votes are being used when it comes to the second preference, right? So when they look into this, all the eliminated candidates ballot sheets, they look into the second preference votes, right? And that those second preference votes are being counted into the remaining candidates who are standing for the election, and the remaining candidates itself, those ballot papers, they're looking into the second preference vote itself. And then sort of then they total it up, right? The cumulative total of the first and second votes are added up, and in the case that the proportion comes to 51% or more, they are deemed the winner of the presidential election, right? Usually in the Sri Lankan context, worst case scenario, it will go to a second round, and best case scenario, they'll just finish off with the first round itself. However, in the parliamentary election system, it's important to know two things, right? 196 seats out of the 255 seats are elected through a multi-member districts itself, right? Under the party list proportional representation system. What that is the parties allocated a number of seats from the quota from each district, allocated from each district, right? The total seats from each district is allocated by the delimitation commission and the election commission itself. I won't go into deep detail about the process, rather. uh, and the proportion is being allocated based on the voter share that they hold in that district. And how they would normally vote is that you choose a one party that you support, and you choose three individuals under that party who are contesting your in your district as your preferences, right? That and then they'll and as a result, they look at the proportion of seats in that particular district. Then they look at the top. Let's say if for example, party A gets 5 seats, and there are about 10 candidates under that party. They look at the um, top five percentage, or the proportion of individual votes they got, and those seats are allocated to the specific party uh, in the parliament, right? And the remaining seats is categorized as the national seats, where the remaining 29 seats are distributed among parties proportional to the voter share on a national basis. And ultimately, the parties have the ultimate choice in filling in those seats, and not necessarily the voters, right?
Thank you very much for that, Marlin. I believe that was a beautiful explanation as to how the election works. It explained how the votes are considered and how the votes are counted and where it is moved, right? Especially with regards to the parliamentary election, it can be quite confusing with regards to why you vote for a single person, how the preferential system works, and even with regards to the presidential election, what happens when there is an instance where a candidate does not reach this 50% margin. So I'm very gladful that you touched on it, and I hope some other time we could address issues with regards to the local authorities election and even the provincial council election, and that would be very interesting, seeing as to the local authority elections are of something of a question mark in these few days. My I have my question right now is towards Farhan. Farhan, I want to ask you, or I want you to remember yourself about what we discussed about, in our meetings, countless meetings, with multiple organizations. There was one thing we continuously touched upon, and that was the rights of persons with disabilities. They are, in fact, the largest and most spread out minority in Sri Lanka, and the people who, and a lot of people with disabilities who, when we spoke to them, they said that their issues were considered as something that could be swept under the rug simply because of how they're spread out, and because they don't have the same power as another minority has. Like, all other minorities are bunched together in one geographical location and they can use it as leverage, and persons with disabilities often lack it. But they are also a valuable part of a society, right? And could you perhaps explain a system that could be used, or a bunch of systems that can be used in conjunction with one another, to assist in voter registration and the election day process, to better promote their rights and to promote them voting for? Like, remember the teaser for this uh, podcast was actually the question of, okay, we have an average voter turnout of 75%. What happens if the rest vote? And I suppose they should massively answer that question, because promoting disabled persons from voting, especially in the context of a presidential election, could help, or could have a chance of making a very big impact.
All right, so this is a particular topic that, when you're talking about electoral systems, doesn't really come to mind as you go deeper into research, deeper into the topic, because This community, this minority, is pretty marginalized, not in terms of how they're perceived by society. I believe Sri Lankan society has a much better acceptance of persons with disabilities than some other countries, for example. But one thing they're marginalized is in conducting their right to vote. So, as of right now, as of status quo, the problem that people with disabilities have is that they have to go through a long and arduous process in order to even get registered for the elections. And this leads to many people actually being kept out from voting. It's a kind of deterrence. The current system is a kind of deterrence for people with disabilities to actually vote for elections. Some of them can't walk, some of them can't hear, some of them can't see. And the current system requires them to go to a doctor, go to the hospital, for some people who can't even walk, and get a doctor's letter in order to be able to vote for advanced voting. Now, in conjunction, simultaneously with our voter registration system, we will essentially have to identify people who are disabled and give them advanced voting rights way ahead of the actual election day. And what this does is actually increases drastically the amount of voters that Sri Lanka would have. And the ways in which we propose to do this are in three ways actually. So one of this is with regards to a person with a long-term disability has to register with the GM. And all the medical records from the past and proof of disability can be used. There doesn't need to be an updated kind of letter for these people, for people with chronic uh, disabilities to vote. So they can continue to use their past medical records, which I think makes the process so much more for them. And what essentially happens is they get qualified for postal voting. And when they get qualified for postal voting, it's so much easier for them to actually vote. So that is one thing. We have another category for people with short-term disabilities. For example, people who have casts on their hands or legs after having a small fall, after having a fracture or a broken leg. So what happens is they also can provide the proof of disability leading up to the elections so that advance voting is made much more easier for them. And finally, this is one thing that we do not consider in election infrastructure, which we definitely should, is how accessible are the polling stations for people with disabilities. So one thing we need to ensure is that there are wheelchair entrances for people with disabilities so that at least they can be brought to the polling stations, that we have things such as ballot papers in braille for people who are blind, and after that there is also sign language for people or election officials to communicate with deaf or mute people. And these are just certain small steps that go a long, long way in ensuring that disabled people do also have fair and equitable right to a voting in the elections. And over to you, Atif.
Thank you very much for that, Farhan. I seriously think that greater amounts of technological developments and facilitation of voting booths and voting pools is quite important. Simply because it's these sorts of people, like their contribution to the set of votes or the total composition of the total polled votes makes a massive difference when it comes to elections such as presidential elections. But it isn't even about whether it matters about the outcome, right? As a sovereign citizen, it's quite important that we respect every element about them: the ability to vote, the ability to be a social member in all aspects of being part of a democracy, right? So I really thank you for that and those sets of recommendations. To all viewers, go through our annex page, go through our proposal, and you'll see that it's much more defined. So the next question I have is to Shahin. Shahin, this question is something that's very important, specifically in a Southeast Asian or an Indian context, Southeast Asian or Indian subcontinent. uh, and I wanted to ask you about the process of electing representatives. So the process of electing representatives is through, I mean, in Sri Lanka specifically, is through the proportional system, right? Where the person is elected through the party votes, but then rather they are selected through their highest preferential votes. and essentially that is a democratic process in Sri Lanka. But can you explain how the flow crossing process affects this, and rather what kind of a system or what sort of a legislative change needs to be brought in order to quite essentially make sure that right the views of the people, such that the legislation itself is a representative of the people's ideas, but not rather their own individual ideas.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's quite. And flow crossing is pretty prevalent not only in Sri Lanka but in a lot of Southeast Asian countries. So, if the viewers don't know, flow crossing refers to the process of politicians switching parties, and as a result, they are crossing the legislation's flow. Usually, the move is from the opposition to government benches after they've been co-opted by the ruling party. So currently, the Constitution of Sri Lanka does not have any sort of legislation against crossing the floor, but crossing the floor is essentially damaging democracy, right? Why? Because Sri Lanka's system of representative democracy is premised on proportional representation, the PR system. So, in national and provincial elections, the total number of valid votes cast constitutes 100% of the whole vote. So, subsequently to elections, the votes accruing to each party are tailored proportionally, and the seats are signed accordingly in line with the formula for representation. So, inherently, when an MP crosses the floor, it distorts that sort of balance of representation that is determined by the citizens of the country through the ballot box, right? So, pretty accurately, this is just an explanation of how you said the system works. So, anti-defection laws is our proposal to preventing crossing the floor. So, anti-defection laws was first introduced in India, if I'm not mistaken, in 1985. In 1985, and the Indian anti-defection law stated that if a member of parliament or a member of the Legislative Assembly of India either voluntarily gave up their membership of the party or voted or abstained in any sort of voted or abstained for voting or defies any party whip, or if he or she joins any other party after being elected and being given a seat, he or she will be disqualified from the party and no longer hold the position or even be nominated to a position again. So basically, you lose your position, you lose the sort of position that you've gained. So the thing is, in Sri Lanka, we don't have this. We don't have this sort of anti-defection law currently, which makes it very easy for politicians to swap parties based on their personal preferences, based on their own political motives and things like that. But what we could do is that we could model off India's anti-defection law. But what we could do differently is that we could also include rules about requiring the formation of independent committees in order to investigate the sort of allegations of ministers, switching between parties, and even possibly the imposition of sanctions on members of these parties if they're proven guilty. And another level to this sort of another level in this mechanism could be from totally banning them from running anywhere in the future. But of course, you see that these are degrees of a mechanism that can be applied. So it doesn't have to be the most extreme. All we are stopping our aim with anti-defection laws at its very premise will only to make sure that ministers do not cross the floor unnecessarily, which of course includes their own political motives. Because at the end of the day, an active democracy makes sure that what the people want in terms of representation is accurately given to them, and that's really, really important. So yeah, anti-defection laws, model of India's anti-defection laws of 1985, could be a good way forward.
Thank you for that, Shaheen. Quite essentially, it is important to understand that flow crossing is a matter that is very common in Sri Lanka, even in the passing of a very recent amendment to the constitution that if I'm not wrong, 20th Amendment to the Constitution, we did see flow crossing happening where members of minority parties switched from their designated parties, or rather the intention of their party or the coalition that they decided to initially start off with, and voted for the government, right? We did see that happening in Sri Lanka, and that is not a single a specific occurrence too. And with regards to how India does it, I totally agree that we need to have much more stronger needs for parties to not only parties but rather the government to create some sort of action through constitution or through any other sorts of acts of parliament that ensures that flow crossing is deemed a crime, and flow crossing needs to be punished with. And with regards to the methods of punishing, I too agree that we need to establish severe different degrees of voting, because especially in Sri Lanka, right, when it's a parliamentary election and the vote, quite essentially the vote is something that is given first and foremost to the party, right? In the parliamentary elections, people don't come in through the first past the post system, and they aren't individual candidates, right? They come through the party, and if they come in through the party, it's important that the party views are first and foremost represented by them, and individuals using their designated powers can do the good they can on their own. And the people of the nation vote for the party first and foremost, and after that is when they vote for the particular person. And again, Shaheen, I can't seem to find words to emphasize the importance of a proper anti-defection laws to be established in Sri Lanka, not just through things that are adopted through perhaps court proceedings. I understand that there is legislation which involves parliamentarians being questioned about whether or not their movement from a position to another position is legal. I can't recollect the case names and the exact details of the cases, but I do know there are instances. But I think that there is no case law that can replace codification of law, codification of legislature, which makes it A, accessible to the people, and B, it makes it very definitive. Thank you very much for that, Shaheen. Guys, so the next question is out to Marlin. Marlin, a very good recommendation that the two of us brought together in that proposal was the introduction of an alternative vote plus system, in conjunction with the mandate to increase the number of multi-member votes that was proposed by Dr. Anila Dias Bandaranaike, a former member of the Delimitation Commission. Uh, could you explain to the viewers how the logistics of it would work and the benefits that it would reap? A, if it was part of a country where the voters are of a very similar background, similar political ideology, or similar ethnic belief, and B, in a part of a country where there is much plurality in population or backgrounds, maybe in terms of their religious identity, their ethnic identity, or even if they are of the same religious and ethnic identity, their political differences.
Right. So the alternative vote plus system compromises of using an alternative vote system and an open list party list proportionality representation system. Right. This sort of electoral system was actually derived from a commission called the Jenkins Committee in 1998. Right. And within that particular report, if I can sum it up in a very brief form, it sort of advocates for 80% of the seats in the House of Commons to be determined to the alternative vote system, and the rest of the 20% to be determined to an open list system, right? But however, Atif, you and me, we decided to approach this in a different way, right? So what we decided was not to sort of not not to base the entirety of all the seats in the local authorities body, whether it's a municipal council or an urban council or a pradeshi sabha, to be granted by both these systems, but in a separate manner. So what I mean by this is, since we both primarily target in a local government elections, so to keep the election trail as localized as possible, we allowed single member districts to follow the alternative vote system, and the multi-member districts to follow up on an open list system, right? So if I were to sort of give an easy comparison on this, is to in single member districts to sort of follow the alternative vote system is a similar form of system to the two round system that I mentioned earlier. and and the multi-member districts follow the exact sort of model that the current parliamentary elections represent, but it's scaled down to a local level. We can see the benefits of this on two levels, right? So with regards to part A of your question, you mentioned about voters in a similar background. We see that individuals do face who are in these sort of backgrounds do face the same sort of problems and dilemmas, right? And these problems and dilemmas can be solved faster if there's a majority rule or a unanimous rule of a party or parties within the local authority that sort of resides within their local area, that sort of they're governing their area, right? And in the case of multi-member votes, we see that coalitions sort of can be formed with parties of similar interest. For example, we see typical example, for example, a ward part of a municipal council in Noor area, right? A major demographic you see within the Noor area district are the Tamils, right? Specifically speaking, the Indian Tamils who work in tea estates, right? And one of the problems that they face is proper adequate housing, the lack of availability for proper and adequate housing for the tea estate workers, right? And we see there are certain Tamil dominated political parties or Tamil oriented parties in the Nuvarelia district, and if they were to be elected in a specific local authority in Nuvarelia, they could form coalitions, and implementation of the mechanisms that find suit can be implemented much faster because of the fact they present a united front, right? And in the case of single member votes, the alternative vote system this allows a voter to vote not for just one but more than one candidate who fits that voter's sort of ideal candidate or a voter's political profile, right? It's all under this we are providing the choice and a higher availability of choice to the voters itself, right? And part B of your question sort of touches on this whole ideal of in areas or in situations where you have large different ethnicities and whatnot, right? We see that parties, in order to stay in power, need the support from individuals of all backgrounds to gain a majority, right? And this sort of forces political parties from to divert a bit from their aspiration of only securing the vote of the majority. This because this shifts away from because this sort of ideally shifted away from plurality system where the most votes win, and sort of pushes for um, the electoral system to on a more preferential manner where no votes are simply wasted and every vote counts, right? So this is all about providing the choice and forcing parties to sort of divest or invest in mandates that typically aren't that they aren't historically identified by. Simply speaking, cater to every need of individuals who are living in your area. Right. Over to you, Atif.
Thank you very much for that, Marlin. It was a great explanation, and I too believe in this whole alternative vote plus system. And I think that the implementation of an alternative vote plus system, it does one thing: it takes the power from the party and it gives it back to the people. And you might ask, okay, Atif, what is the problem with having the power in the hands of a party? Because ultimately, even if it is the parliamentary election, we are voting for the party. But the local election system, or how it currently works, is that the members who are chosen are decided by not the person who takes the highest number of votes, but rather as to the aspectives or the thoughts of the leader and the secretary of the party. And the problem we have with that is if you fall out of favor with the party leader or the party secretary, inherently that will affect your ability to score more votes or to achieve more votes and come into power, even if you are the most capable candidate out of them all. And I want to thank you for giving us a great explanation on that regard. The next question we have out is to Imad. Imad, final question for you. This is on a topic that I really, really enjoy. That's about the implementation of technology in making available the right of information that we, as sovereign citizens of Sri Lanka, have. Right? Now, in terms of technology that we use to demarcate land and make information available to the layperson, we are far behind compared to many other countries which have made directories available online. Could you elaborate on this and explain to us how exactly we can fix it? the issues that we have with our current mapping system and what needs to be done to keep us in par and informed.
Sure. So even I'm really excited about the implementation of technology in the process of delimitation, which is more of a newer concept these days. So before, when I spoke about, for example, the official web portal, there it was more on the lines of impartiality, where where essentially the public is going to act as the sort of checks and balance system to keep the delimitation commission in hold, to ensure that, you know what, that they're transparent. Here what we're talking about is that the implementation of technology has the purpose of modernizing data collection systems, which is extremely important. Why is it important? Because a lot of the data that is collected in, for example, the census or other data that's used for such decisions make have a profound impact, because this same data is going to be used by the delimitation commission to make extremely important decisions about whether to redraw electoral boundaries or how to split certain districts and things like that, which is extremely important. So when it comes to data collection, currently you see that the traditional method, the primary method that's being used now, is the data from the census. And if you look back at the census, it's conducted every 10 years. So the last available census happened in 2012, and this lacks the sort of data consistency that a modern country with a modern electoral system requires, because it fails to record population movements. By this I mean things like urbanization, the impact of natural disasters. So these could cause massive ripples to the demographic changes in certain parts of Sri Lanka. And this is bad because you're now hindering the progress of the commission. Why? Because you're allowing this opportunity and avenues to go towards things like underrepresentation. So, for example, the issue that happened in Jaffna in 2012, where the number of seats was reduced from 9 seats to 6 seats. So things like that, incidents like that, are more likely to occur the moment a set standard of data consistency isn't available in a country. And it's really important to incorporate a respect for communities of interest in the election process. And the way to incorporate this respect is by modernizing data systems. How does our proposal do this? Firstly, our proposal makes use of two important mechanisms. Firstly, the proposal recognizes that census data is important. It it's being used as a primary basis. However, we're trying to complement such data, because in addition, we're trying to include this bottom up approach, where we're using representative surveys. For example, the household income and expenditure survey, which is more frequent. It happens every 3 years, and is able to record the population density in areas of interest to the government, or in areas where there have been mass population movements. So this is significant in identifying population changes, and therefore could provide a better roadmap towards making decisions regarding demarcation. The second system that I'm going to talk about is the use of technology in, like you said, digitizing maps. For example, things like basic systems like Google Earth, even GIS technology, which is highly popular in the UK, along with enhanced satellite imagery. And with the growing availability of such technology, it's allowing for the system of delimitation to happen more seamlessly, right? So, for example, there was a trial run of this system that happened in Hambantota, where they used GIS technology and something called geocoded data, where they were able to digitize maps, right? And this is extremely important. Why? Because currently, if you look at the system, that the Delimitation Commission still uses maps and data dating back to the 1950s and 60s, and that adversely affects the conclusions of commissions. Even if the commission was to provide newer findings, it's not going to be as accurate, it's not going to be as effective as it should be. So what's happening here? What we are trying to recommend is that this pilot system that happened in Hambantota reduce the sort of ambiguity that existed in demarcation, because, for example, it resulted in this precise identification of boundaries, and local issues are minimized. Why? Because disputes over personal property, infrastructure, natural landscape features, which are important in constructing maps, were able to be recognized and hence rectified. Such methods could also be extended to other districts. And what is the consequence of this? You're allowing for universal voter suffrage. Why? And the most effective electoral system is more likely to be imposed to generate more discourse, and that there's a closer connection between voters and their representative, because now the commission has a robust understanding of population density in certain areas, and can therefore enact changes that could lead to significant improvements in terms of representation, like Shahin spoke about. So here we are resolving local problems through such a data management. And like you said, an added benefit is that it upholds the right to information, because now when these maps are digitized and the process becomes more advanced technology, with, for example, the addition of the web portal and the online service, now changes can be made and published to the public to show maybe amendments or redrawing of certain boundaries, which is important for the people to know why such changes take place, to uphold international systems and values that should exist in a modern electoral system. And this is what our proposal fundamentally tries to solve.
Thank you very much for that, Imad. I think that an updated system, like Farhan had maintained, like I have maintained throughout the course of our discussion, is key in making sure that as a country we are upright and we are in the hopes of protecting our democracy. But apart from that, there's this interesting point that I wanted to include in the conversation as well, and that was uh, evoking a compulsory period for boundary limitation. And I think in our proposal, we evoked a time frame to be set by the governance, to be legislated in an act of parliament, through an act of parliament, along with the annexure that we have. Viewers, you can click the link on my IG page, or if you're viewing this through YouTube, you can click the link in the description, or Facebook similarly, and you will have access to the document. But an annexure that we have attached describing the sort of things or content that should exist in an active parliament that dictates the workings of the delimitation commission. And I think apart from maintaining this constant period, there was one interesting thing that I noticed in a bunch of extremely specific and advanced democracies, and that was the ability to have specific ad hoc limitations for specific parts, right? An instance that we could see its importance is when, for instance, let's take, for example, the first delimitation, the most recent delimitation took place in 2007, for instance, hypothetically. But once the war was over, the country had the opportunity to delimitate and have a look at the geographic situation in parts of Jaffna. And by making this statutory provision, we allow the country to have in itself the best interest it has to the people, right? And this sort of a situation, it would have been extremely helpful if it had been available to us back in the day. Shahin, last question to you. Last but not the least, a question that I think is extremely important and ends on the note of essentially the whole purpose of the conversation that we have today, and that is to ensure that the legal system or natural justice system is at its utmost peak and it's highly respected in our country, right? Unfortunately, in the recent years, we have seen instances where parliamentarians are found guilty for crimes after being appointed as members of parliament. However, such removal of people in power goes against this democratic process by which these members of parliament in the first place are brought into the parliament, right? Uh, and this is quite essentially does not represent the view to remove these members of parliament who have committed crime and bring someone else who weren't democratically elected. Could you give us a model of a system that can be used to prevent this problem from happening in the first place and ensuring that we have an ironclad legal system that ensures that the democratic process is of its utmost importance at all times?
That's quite accurate, Atif. And I don't think a lot of people know this, but a lot of parliamentarians, especially in Sri Lanka, are accused, or some of them even some are accused of doing certain things that are deemed unlawful, and some of them to an extent of crime, right? And that has caused a fair share of public discourse, mostly that's negative, about how the public feels cheated, right? So the best way, Atif, for us to deal with that, there is a model which prepares, right? So before I get into that, let me just tell everybody how the democratic process works, right? It's very, very simple. It's all of us go, we cast one vote for a particular representative of a particular party, and based on majorities, they get elected, right? So essentially, the party that gets elected is the party that a majority of the people want to see ruling, right? Or want to see having a word at the discussion table, right? And therefore, if you have this sort of legislation to disqualify a parliamentarian after after they have been put into office, and you see that they're being replaced by some other person, that's undemocratic on two levels. Because the people feel like they are completely out of their loop, because people only vote and continue to vote when they know that their views are being expressed. The moment they feel like they are being suppressed, which most often happens when you just suddenly replace a parliamentarian, and because there isn't the best amounts of transparency within the government, people quite often don't know why these shifts happen, and therefore people feel cheated. But secondly, and more importantly, I think it also looks bad on the Sri Lankan government and parliamentarians, and how the justice system works, and the justice system in Sri Lanka works in the international view, right? Because we look like a country who can't put out candidates who are capable, right? But most often than that, that's not really the case, right? So the system that we would put in place, the sort of mechanism that we want to see in place, would be where the election commission must be informed of existing entanglements that a particular person from a party already has, right? And along with that, so you're not keeping the election commission in office, and therefore not keeping the people in the dark. And we also would want something like a character of good certificate from the sort of party, right? There's two reasons why you want that character of good certificate. The first is that it's easier to hold them accountable, right? Because a successful democracy is one that is transparent with its people, right? And therefore, having this character certificate inherently increases that sort of transparency and therefore trust. But secondly, it also acts as a tool, a positive PR tool for the party themselves, right? Because now they are putting out a statement, giving these people the sort of assurance that the candidates that they're putting out are honestly the best that the country has to produce, right? Regardless of the sort of existing entanglements, right? Because a lot of them are merely accused and not proven, right? And therefore, that sometimes can become very, very beneficial, right? And then it's up to the election commission to file a special action naming both the party and the representative. And then, you'd have to review their criminal record according to the rules of natural justice. And then it's up to the Supreme Court themselves to review that petition, ideally about 2 weeks before the nomination date comes out, and and therefore this must be communicated with the election commission on whether or not that person with entanglements can or cannot compete. And that's really important. Why? Because the Supreme Court is seen as that one institution that's only aim is to do justice, justice, right, to the people of Sri Lanka. And therefore, these kind of courts have a lot of role to play in the sort of decision that people make, right? And these kind of courts are actually, these kind of institutions actually are looked up to by people. People really trust these court of decisions, and the decisions that come out of these Supreme Courts and other important decision-making institutions really translate into people's actions, right? So in this case, if the Supreme Court has reviewed the petition and believes that the person is suitable to compete in the elections and have a position of power, probably in the parliament or any other place of power, then that sort of confidence will translate into the people. And that's when you see people actually making rational political decisions. Because a lot of the time, political decisions aren't made rationally, and that is extremely damaging, right? Because the political decision that one person makes, I don't think they realize the sort of impact that it has not only on their generation, but all the generations to come after. So the moment you have this sort of robust mechanism in place, you're doing two things. A, you're deterring people who may have entanglements that they know are accurate to not enter. And B, you're also really uplifting the entire principle of democracy that Sri Lanka has continuously wanted to hold since its very inception. So yes, I believe that answers your question.
Thank you very much for that, Shine. And I believe too that persons with indictments, you got to understand that through any legal system, the presumption that a person is innocent until guilt is proven is important. But by maintaining that stance, if we are to allow members of parliament to come into power, even though there is a very high possibility that they can, first and foremost, be found guilty, and second and foremost, make use of this immunity that they gain as being members of parliament, is something that's extremely dangerous. And that's why a lot of countries, a lot of members, politicians, a lot of activists around the world are even opposed about the level of immunity that even a president of a nation gains, right? Like not Sri Lanka, across the world, United States of America, right? In the US, I mean the UK, right? That's something that a lot of people are questioning. But thank you very much for the questions. Thank you very much for everyone who's here, right? Farhan, thank you very much. Imad, thank you. Shaheen, and same goes with Marlin. But before we end, I wanted to talk about a system, like final note, a system that is along the themes of what Shaheen talked about, strengthening Sri Lankan legal system, and that is the introduction of an alternative dispute resolution mechanism that is employed during an election period. Now, this system is something that is derived off of a practice, and if I'm not wrong, in Nigeria, where we have a very similar economic structure, a sort of political dilemma, and we also have a situation where members of parliament, or rather election actually taking place, could cause a lot of crime and a lot of conflicts. And this alternative dispute resolution mechanism involves where the Ministry of Justice works along with the election commission, and along with that, envisioning the presidential uh, goal to increase the number of smaller courts, right? The president, the Minister of Justice, Honorable Mr. Ali Sabri, had stated that they wanted to bring in smaller courts, and I think this mandate really supports that. And how it would work like this, right? We have quasi courts, mediators, or counsellators, or to even introduce lay magistrates, which work with the Ministry of Justice, which will have the responsibility um, of actually ensuring that the conflicts are resolved within the framework or the time period of an election, because an election is a very short period, less than an year. Like it's even smaller than an year if you are to consider all the entire spectrum of an election. And if we are to allow this to enter into the already stagnant, already broken legal system of Sri Lanka, which is in massive backlog, that would cause nothing but problems, and it would be extremely ineffective, because most of the fights, the conflicts, the arguments that we have during an election period is simply based off of hearsay, simply arguments that are unnecessary and take place out of heat and out of the situation and the climate that exists. So I think the introduction of an ADR system, where the government works with our proposal, reads through our proposal, the annexure that we have adopted and provided, explained, I think the government would see a great revolution in the manner in which the election is actually handled, the peace that we would enjoy during an election, and to see us in a subpar level of countries that are known to be extremely peaceful democracies. And with that note, everyone, thank you very much for staying patiently for this long, enjoying the podcast, and we would love to hear your comments. You can contact us through any medium, any forum that we make this available through. You can definitely check out Hype Sri Lanka, who's the website will be made available for you, and you can check out the work we've done. And on that note, I would like to say good night and have a great day.